Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the wonderful world of wine with Kim and Mark. Every week we explore trending topics in the wine world and speaking to wine personalities from across the world. How are you this week, Mark?
Everything's great, Kim. Always excited to talk wine and welcome another special guest today.
Indeed. So we are speaking today with Ray Isle, who is a wine writer, a wine journalist, a published author, and someone with many, many years of wine writing under his belt. Welcome to the show, Ray.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we primarily wanted to talk to you about your book, but we really love to have people from different parts of the industry on our show. And so for us to talk to you, who has all of this writing and publishing background, I think is really exciting for our listeners because you have written for a number of different places that they probably have seen your writings if they keep up with wine journalism. So can you tell our listeners just a little bit about you and what you do?
Yeah, sure. My sort of full-time job is the executive wine editor at Food and Wine magazine, where I've been for quite some time. In fact, long enough that I'm executive wine editor because they ran out of, when they promoted me, they're like, I guess we better make him executive because we've run out of words. So I've been there quite a while, since 2005, and it's been a great home for me. It's a wonderful magazine. A lot of really great people work there. But I write online for Food and Wine. I've written for a variety of other magazines in the past. I started out at Wine and Spirits magazine quite a while ago. And I do some TV from time to time and radio and podcasts. So I was recently on CBS Mornings and I've been on Today Show a bunch of times. And it's certainly nothing I ever expected to do, but it is a lot of fun. And then I published this book called The World in a Wine Glass, not this past November, but the November before. And that was a big project that took a long time. It's a 700-page book. So it took a little bit of doing, to say the least.
Ray, I have one Food and Wine magazine question, and then I'm going to ask you all things about the book because I loved it.
He's so excited to talk to you about this book.
Great. I'm thrilled.
You said you started Food and Wine in 2005. For me, the Food and Wine magazine was like the first magazine in the industry that you could go to any store and it would see it on the shelf about food and wine. And lately, it seems like it's harder to find, even though the subscription is still very affordable. Is the focus now more on the digital side of Food and Wine? I know you write a million articles I see online all the time. Are those exactly the same that go into the magazine publication?
Yeah, so the short version is that publishing has changed since I started at Food and Wine, and we were a magazine first and foremost. I mean, we had a rudimentary website, but it wasn't that substantial, and the magazine really drove everything. And we're now, I guess you would say, a media brand in that there's a magazine, still exists and still has great circulation, and there's a website, and we do events, and there's e-commerce and all of this stuff. And we've always been owned by a larger company. Originally, that was Amex Publishing. Now it's a company called Dot Meredith, which is very digital focused. But to answer your question specifically, so my stuff, I still am primarily print. Most of what I write runs first in the magazine and then later online. I do also some purely digital content, mostly because I love writing about wine, and there's only so many pages in a magazine, and I end up with stories that I couldn't fit in the magazine that I want to run, somewhere else. And so those appear online. Our magazine, and this is true for a lot of magazines, the reason you don't see it in stores as much is because there's just not as much demand for print magazines at grocery stores or wherever. We're used to find them all the time by the checkout counter. So really, even though our circulation hasn't dropped at all, it's skews much more towards subscription than it once did. It used to be the newsstand, what they call newsstand was a much bigger percentage of what we do. And now the magazine, the printed magazine, actually primarily goes to subscribers. And that's just a kind of a structural change in the magazine world itself. That's pretty true for a lot of magazines. Some magazines barely or don't exist anymore. I mean, if you remember, if you're old enough and you remember back, as I do, I mean, once upon a time, Time and Newsweek were the way people got news. Those magazines had massive circulation, and there's no weekly news cycle anymore. It's all online, and it's probably a 10-minute news cycle. So a weekly magazine that tells you about news doesn't even really function in today's society. Thankfully, we're not news driven. We're culinary and gastronomic recipes and wine driven, and that doesn't have that kind of really short lead time. The magazine, actually, people like to hang on to it. I've met lots of people with stacks and stacks of food and wine before.
I have my little stash on my bookshelf with my other food magazines from many, many years ago, but
Excellent.
they are still good resources to keep a hold of.
They are. And when you're cooking, unlike a phone or an iPad, if you spill sauce on them, you will destroy a $500 object. So there's that too.
Some of those old magazines with recipes that I've been making for like 10 to 15 years, those are very valuable to me.
Yeah.
Very important.
Absolutely.
So, Ray, let's talk about the book, The
Yeah.
World in a Wine Glass. I want to thank you for putting out a book like this because it's so on to what Kim and I talk to our listeners about every week, just not 700 pages worth of content that we talk about. But I want to just say a few things. I feel it's a guide to shopping better, smarter, and small. And there's a couple of quotes I want to tell our listeners that you say in this book. The first is that not to say mass-produced wines don't taste good. Often it does, but so does Taco Bell taco. And I thought a great summary of the wine industry. Also, you said a vast percent of the wines in the world are mass-produced and products measured by the movement off of grocery store shelves. And you said something about corporate noise. So
Yeah.
I'd like you to explain to the listeners your view on big brands versus small producers and your whole concept of the book seemed to be on that. So I'd just like you to explain a little bit to the listeners your feelings
Yeah,
on it.
absolutely. I put that in there about Taco Bell because I actually like Taco Bell tacos. I mean, I'm one of the millions and millions of people who think they taste pretty good. I use the analogy to wine because it's a pretty straightforward one. And the truth is, I hope this doesn't completely disillusion any listeners who are Taco Bell fans, but when you go to a Taco Bell and you drive up to the hatch and some person hands you 3 crunchy tacos, they didn't actually grill the meat themselves and make the taco shells, nixtamalize the corn for the taco shells themselves, and they didn't season them carefully while they were in the pan and so on. It's a pretty prefabricated object, and it's something that's done with a lot of, Taco Bell, they have labs that test things like the pounds per square inch of crunch that humans like best. And the result is it's a product that tastes good. It's meant to taste good. It's designed to taste good. And there's a lot of wine like that. There's a lot of wine that is made in the millions of cases. Unlike let's say in the 60s or 70s or something, there's not that much wine out there that's really actively bad and flawed. Cheap wine, or even expensive wine. It's all pretty clean and pretty well made, but a lot of it is really just kind of a beverage product. It doesn't have what I think is so fascinating about wine, which is it doesn't come from a specific place. It wasn't made by a specific person with a specific personal view of what they want to make. It's more marketing committee wine. And when I got into wine, what excited me about getting into wine, and the reason I stay excited about wine is not just how it tastes, because I absolutely love, I drink a lot of wine. I love the taste of wine, but I really love the people who make wine and the places it comes from. And that sense with a wine that there's something beyond the taste, that there's an expression of a certain piece of land, or there's an expression of a kind of cultural history, or there's an expression of a winemaker's belief that they really want to make this kind of wine and from this place. You can drink perfectly tasty wine your entire life without worrying about any of that. It's kind of like drinking, a can of Bud on a cold day after you've mowed the lawn tastes pretty good, but it's certainly not artisanal in any way. And so I wanted to kind of call attention to both some great producers like that and also talk about why you gain something from drinking wines that have that kind of soul to them, in a sense, that aren't just a product, that are the product of some kind of human passion and talent and skill. So that was what I wanted. You're exactly right. That was kind of the initial focus for the book. And the other thing that it concentrates on is the sort of people who are growing grapes and in a way that's kind of beneficial to the earth rather than detrimental. So sustainability, organics, biodynamics, regenerative farming. And those two worlds dovetail together pretty closely. That's pretty much all the people that I write about. I would have picked them without knowing that they were working sustainably and organically. And it turns out they are, because that's most of the people I write about live on the land that they're farming. As one Italian winemaker said to me, my kids are running around in the vineyards every day. Why would I spray chemicals all over them?
Yeah.
So there's that to think about too.
Not an uncommon thing that we've heard from a number of, especially European winemakers, these smaller production. Maybe the winery has been in the hands of the same family for a number of generations, but that's their home.
Yeah,
This is their
absolutely.
yard. So they have this real emotional attachment to their place because it is their family.
That kind of concept, it is more European than US, but it's that a little bit that concept of being the caretaker of the place for this generation, but it's going to go on after you and it went on before you, and you don't want to mess it up for the people who come next. With small producers in the U.S., it's interesting is just the way the wine world is in the U.S. Small producers tend to instead work with a number of different vineyards that are owned by various people. Not everybody has the resources to buy their own land, and not everybody has a history going back 300 years. Certainly in the U.S., there's nobody has a 300-year history,
right?
unless they've covered it up really well. But even so, when I talk to someone like Pax Maley, or I talk to Ross Cobb, or these people who are making wine from a number of vineyards, they have a very Ted Lemon at Literai. They have a very specific focus about the kind of growers they want to work with and the ways those people are working. So it kind of nets out to the same thing in a sense.
Right. You mentioned expressions of the wine, and throughout the book, I think you give the best advice for people looking to purchase wine. When you say, ask yourself, where is it made, or how is it made? Who creates this wine? And I see and read your wine reviews all the time, and I feel I know wine. Kim might say I don't, but I feel I know wine being in retail as a wine buyer. And when I see your reviews, I still have to research them. So I'm wondering, when you put out a wine review, or when you find a wine that you review, are you looking for people to do exactly that, to dig deeper into the wine?
Yeah, I'm primarily looking for wines that you can't. I think what I say in the book is, like, if there's no answer to the question, like, where specifically did it come from, who actually made it, why is it made the way it was made? If you can't get those answers, and a lot of multi-million case wineries don't have an answer to that, that's where my red flags go up. And I try to write almost exclusively about that kind of wine for Food and Wine. Sometimes I have to take into account that Food and Wine has a really big audience, and I can't solely write about micro production wines, because I'll get endless emails from people saying, I can't find this wine.
Right.
And that's totally fair. And certainly there are some larger producers who are conscientious about how they farm. And so I kind of look at that too. I think that you gain so much from knowing those things about a wine that it really changes the experience of drinking it too. You have to want to spend a little time just knowing something about the wine to do that. And I will say this, and you sell wine. The other thing I always suggest is find a wine store that is staffed by people who actually talk to you and know something about wine, and who will listen to what you're interested in and suggest some cool things, because you may pay $1 more or $2 than you do at some kind of giant miles of aisles place, but it's so worth it. It's how I learned about wine, was going to wine stores that were small and that would take the time to tell me things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's Kim and I. We try to offer that advice all the time. It's just hard to get the word out in wine education that there is a difference. And I think that's what your book really puts forward, talking about what the organics are, sustainable, and then diving deep into wineries and why you recommend them and the stories behind them. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to write, in a way, the book is, I think there's like 267 profiles in the book. And it's, in a way, they're all stories about the people and the place and their wines. And my kind of hope is that I don't expect people to read the book straight through, because it is long, and you can pop in or read about Tuscany and pop back out and then pick it up another day and read about Portugal. But my sort of overarching hope is that people would read these profiles of people, and a lot of it's in interviews, a lot of it's people, winemakers' own voices, and come away thinking, gosh, I really want to taste that wine now. That's kind of the agenda of the book, if it has one, is converting people to all these wines that I think are so great.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. Today, we are joined by a special guest, Ray Isle. You can find Ray on his website, rayisle.com. If you want more information about Kim, you can go to her website, commonwealthwineschool.com. For more information about myself, you can go to franklinliquors.com. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Welcome back, everybody. We're talking talking to Ray Isle today. And Ray, we're talking a lot about your book. You mentioned stories. You mentioned you like wines that have, quote, more, and
Yeah.
drink what you like, be happy with what you drink. And I have to tell you, you had a story in Italy section in Tuscany about a producer from Chianti by the name of Diana Lenzi.
Yeah. Yeah. She's
And
great.
of course, being Lenzi, I said, "Oh my God, I have to." And this is what I love about books like yours. And I look it up. Her wine is not sold in the state, but I end up communicating with her,
Oh,
and
that's
it's
super.
just the story. So my question to you is, what is your best wine story like that, where you met someone and they knew someone, like something like that, that just got you excited about a wine?
Oh gosh, there's so I mean there are literally so many of them. It's a lot of years of doing that. I think let me think what would be my favorite is hard to say. I mean, I certainly know the wine that turned me on to wine in the first place, or maybe convinced that wine was really extraordinary, which
Oh,
was a
Kim loves those stories.
yeah,
The
this
first
was a
I
wine.
I
do.
wrote about
I do.
it for Food and Wine actually too. This was a 1984 Diamond Creek Volcanic Hill Cabernet that I had eons ago, obviously, pre-wine writing career. And I was with a father of a former girlfriend and her and at a restaurant that doesn't exist anymore. And I guess he'd been there to Diamond Creek and he ordered it. And this was like 6 years down from 84. This is probably 1990. I mean, I remember very clearly taking a sip and then taking another sip and thinking, oh, that's really good. And then taking another sip and thinking, what the hell? This is amazing. And then I also remember
Haha.
something that everybody in the wine business knows, which is when you get to the end of the last glass and there's no more in the bottle, and you're like, oh, dang.
Yep.
It's like, do I finish it? Do I hang on to it? And I went back years later and I missed meeting Al Bronson. He'd passed away, but I met his wife Boots and that kind of it was almost like a little pilgrimage to that winery. That was a great story. But there's been others, a lot of stories. Writing the book, certainly some winemakers told me stories about other winemakers that then got me to interview them or got me to include them in the book. That moreness, that when I talked about the term wine having moreness, that is directly from a guy named Damien Deschanel, who makes natural wines at Lagrange Tefane. And he talks about that quality of wine having something beyond just flavor and taste and so on, that there's a kind of, especially when you've got expression of place and you've got passion behind it and you're farming in a way that kind of allows that to be expressed, you've got something beyond just the fact that it's fermented grape juice in a glass. That was a pretty cool story. The other great story for me about kind of wine and that just came out of talking to a winemaker was a winery called Shab Nevada in Georgia, which I included in the book, even though the wines are damn near impossible to come by in the US at this point. Shab Nevada is a monastery, and they've been making wine in Georgia since forever. I think they stopped during the time it was part of the USSR. But the monk there, I was tasting with him, and they're religious. They're little legit Eastern Orthodox monks or whatever. And I'm not all that religious. But I said something to him about, isn't it weird to think of someone out in like Denver, Colorado, drinking this wine that you made here in Georgia? And he said, yes, it would be weird, but, this is his view of things, God sort of unites us all. And so in some sense, from me to Denver to someone in Denver is not that far because we're all connected. And I think that's something that applies to wine, even if you're not specifically religious, that there's a kind of a community and a passion for it that has traveled through 8,000 years of history and kind of links, there's a social component to wine that links people together that's really significant and really exciting. And it's that's a little bit of what I was trying to write about too, in a sense.
We seem to always come back to this. Wine is more than grape juice in a glass, that it's not even just a food product, which some people view wine as food, especially if you're looking back on kind of the European mentality about wine. It's not just the beverage in the glass. It's all
Yeah.
of those other things that are a part of it. It's the history, it's the cultural implications. I study food, so there's all of this other stuff that is tied up with the meaning of food, whether it's cultural or religious or health, whatever. And wine really does seem to carry a lot of those same markers that food does. So I always love to talk to people who kind of have that same viewpoint
Yeah.
on where wine kind of fits in with that cultural, we're humans and humans have this particular relationship to food, and wine just really dovetails into that really well. So even if you're a monk in Georgia,
Yes,
you still
exactly.
have sort of a similar philosophy. And I just find people like that literally all over the world who have that same sort of philosophy when it comes to food and beverage and the meaning. It's not just what you're consuming, but it's also the meaning that we apply to those things as well. And that's what got me into wine, was that whole part of it. And then I realized that this is really delicious. So, it's like so nice when the two of them just come together.
Yeah, it is so nice when the two of them come together. And it's funny, there's this kind of neo-temperance, anti-alcohol thing going on right now. And there's no question that if you abuse alcohol, it's bad. It's bad for you, it's bad for other people. But I do think that there's a kind of a tarring with a broad brush everything with alcohol in it at the moment. And I just think there's a categorical difference between wine, especially wine that's made with a kind of tradition behind it, and like a trash can full of Everclear and Kool-Aid. There's one is just meant to get you drunk. And wine has substance beyond that. It is one of the ridiculous aspects about the wine business is that people rarely talk about the fact that it has alcohol in it. It does, but it has more than that too. It has more history, it has more culture, it has more artisan qualities, and I don't know. I just think it's a little too easy to say all bad,
Yeah, I know that you have studied the history of all of these things and you've written about it in some of your articles, but being a historian of food, but also wine specifically, this is not a new thing. Like, and this demonization is certainly not new to the 21st century or the 20th century or the 19th century, but to other alcoholic beverages that were sort of tarred with the same brush, like gin versus beer back in the 1800s.
Right.
There's always this circular historical thing going on. So hopefully with the turn of the wheel, we'll maybe get past
we did try this thing called Prohibition once. It didn't work out all that well.
It didn't really work out very well. And now look at the systems we're left with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the three-tier system is kind of
Yay.
problematic.
Talking about food, I want to ask you, Ray, about wine additives and ingredients. In your book, you mentioned Velcorin.
Velcorin, yeah.
Kim and I had interviewed a winemaker who introduced us to it. I'd like to ask you what your thoughts are on the nutrition or ingredient labeling that's being talked about, and in general, additives in wine. And why do you think people care about their food they're eating, but they don't care or research the wine that they're drinking?
Well, it's a really good question. And a winemaker named Mark Neal in Napa, who was one of the people in the book, Neal Family Wines, said to me, it's like people go to Whole Foods and they carefully pick out their organic lettuce and pick out their organic cucumbers and buy their organic chicken, and they get the wine aisle. They're like, what the hell? I don't know. I'll just take this.
Yeah.
And it's strange. There's a couple of things. There's a couple of structural things. The food is regulated by the FDA. Wine is regulated by the TTB. It's not required to have ingredient labeling because it's not regulated as a food product. I remember reading at some point, Spain, for instance, wine is considered a food product as part of something that goes on the table. The US, it's considered a vice. It falls under the ACABAL. It used to be the BATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And then I guess they decided firearms should be more easily available, and they just changed it to alcohol and tobacco. So just a topic for another time, and probably a really complicated one we won't get into. But the other thing that's complicated about wine in terms of ingredient labeling is that there are a lot of things you can do in the winemaking process that don't end up as ingredients. So Velcorin's a really good example. Velcorin's a sterilant that it's actually used a lot in fruit juice production because it kills off any bacteria, but it's pretty lethal. You have to have a hazmat suit to do an application of it. You have to be trained. And for, I think it's 48 hours, I could be wrong, after you use Velcorin on a wine or on a fruit juice, it's for 48 hours. It would be poison if you drank it. And then it degrades down, theoretically, to CO2 and water, I believe. But that doesn't show up as an ingredient, even if you ingredient labeled wine. But it does kind of raise a question of if you need that making your wine, maybe you should think about how you're making your wine.
Right.
If you need to spray an endless amount of Roundup on your grapes, then maybe there's something about the way you're farming that needs looking at. And I like to think that the best approach to making wine is the least intervention that will still produce a good wine. The natural wine world, the quote unquote natural wine world, is against as much or all intervention, with the result that some natural wines are fine and some natural wines are funky and weird to varying degrees. There is no innately natural wine, because innately natural wine would be grapes literally falling off the vine and fermenting in a puddle under the vine in the mud. There's always human intervention if the end result is wine. But there are a lot of things you can do. And then there's some things that would count as, additives like, mega purple, which is a super hyper concentrate of, I forget, ruby red something grapes. And you add it to wines, usually more mass produced wines, to bulk up the color and bulk up the fruitiness. And that is, to me, not as interesting a wine as a wine that's made honestly. It's funny, I just did a story on non-alcoholic wines because I mean, I'm a journalist as well as a wine lover, and that's a trend that's happening.
It's the hot
And
topic right now.
it's the
It
hot topic,
really
but
is.
what's really interesting is that non-alcoholic wines are regulated by the FDA because they're not alcoholic. And so there are ingredient labels on non-alcoholic
So
wines.
are they considered food technically?
Yeah, I think they're considered food. And
So
so if
non-alcoholic wine is food, but alcoholic wine is not.
is not. And in the realm,
Wild.
I mean, and you guys aren't in New York, but in the crazy world of New York liquor laws, a wine store can sell wine and liquor, but it cannot sell non-alcoholic wine because that's has to be sold by a grocery store.
Yeah. I went to school in New York, so trying
Yeah.
to buy your beer when you're 21 years old
That's where
stuff
your
is
brain starts to
difficult.
spin around in your head, and you're like, this is crazy stuff. But I was looking at the labels, and the thing about non-alcoholic wine is that because it doesn't have alcohol, you automatically have to end up using preservatives because alcohol innately keeps, your bacteria down and all that kind of thing. And so most of the NA wines have some kind of preservative content, not just sulfur, which is common to a lot of wines, but other things as well. And they've all also been de-alcoholized and treated. So they're actually much more unnatural than regular wine, which is worth noting, I think.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many recently new non-alcoholic products I've been told, well, they have this patented technology and they're
Yeah.
not doing this. I'm already sick of it. And
Yeah.
yeah.
It's tough with wine. I tasted so many NA wines, and it's kind of like I found a few that I thought were good, but there's a lot of not good out there. Beers they've managed better with. There's less alcohol to take out, for one thing.
Right. Less manipulation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've found the same thing that, but yeah, not for non-alcoholic beer. It's definitely. I feel like the starting point was already better. Like even when I was pregnant many years ago, and there was non-alcoholic beer choices that I could actually enjoy and be like, okay, I'm getting my beer fix here. Still, the wine is not. Yeah, generally not up to the
No,
level that I want it to be.
it's not the same as wine.
Not the same.
It's like
It's not the
a
same.
shadow of the real thing.
All right,
So,
let's talk about wine tasting. You mentioned 3 categories of tasting: factual, relational, and impressionistic. Can you explain to us and our listeners, when you're evaluating the millions of wines you taste every year, are you quickly in your head thinking these 3 things are what you need to research or discover when you're tasting a wine?
yeah, that's actually a little bit more about writing about wine. There's a lot of wines for Food and Wine. I'm almost always looking for value for money. I don't write about a lot of super high-end wines because that's not our audience. Much as I love to drink them, and much as I love someone else to pay for them, it's not what I primarily write about. But what that sort of way of thinking is that there are some aspects of wine when you're describing it that are a direct description of something factual about the wine. So let's say it smells like oak. Well, that's because it's been in new oak barrels. It actually does smell like oak. There's no metaphor. There's no, you're not kind of saying, well, it smells sort of like oak. It actually was in oak and it absorbed oak lactones and it smells like oak. The relational ones are more where you say like, it smells like blackberries. There are no blackberries in the wine, but there are probably some chemical compounds that are similar to blackberries. And so it reminds you of blackberries, or it recalls blackberries or cherries, or take your pick, citrus. And then there's these kind of terms that are more just kind of impressionistic, which is like when you say a wine is, the classic one is you say a wine's dry. Well, it's a glass full of liquid. It's not dry in the slightest. It's
All
wet. But we say dry to mean not sweet. And people say the wines are svelte, or they're elegant, or they have class, or or they're tough or muscular or masculine or feminine. All of those are metaphorical ways of talking about what a wine tastes like. And what it breaks down to is that you're trying to use words to describe something that's not a word. Very good professor of mine in grad school in literature at BU actually said one of the weird things is that the only form of criticism that's in the actual language of the thing itself is literary criticism, where you're using words to analyze something that is in fact in words. Otherwise, if you're writing about dance, or you're writing about movies, or you're writing about movies to some degree because there's words in them. Let's say you're writing about paintings, or you're writing about dance, or you're writing about wine, you're trying to take words to describe something that just is simply not verbal, and you automatically have a little noise in the system there. And good wine writers, I think, get across what a wine tastes like. And then we've all read god-awful wine descriptions where you just read them and you're like, what on earth are you talking about?
Right. Do you think the reviews lately have gone towards more geeky than informational, like just
Yeah.
general?
I mean, I don't have a lot of use for long lists of adjectives or fruits. I think that critical reviews tend to lean a lot towards very straightforward description. It's like, it tastes like damson plums with a little bit of pepper, and it's lithe and coiled and tart acidity, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. And you can go on spinning out words like that forever. And eventually, realistically, nobody knows what the hell it is you're describing and what it tastes like. And that's why what I try and do with descriptions at Food and Wine is have some mention of what it tastes like or its character in terms of its taste. But I always try and get in some information about who made it, what the winery is, where it's from, why it is the way it is. Even if it's 2 or 3 sentences, better a short version of that than to simply just have lists of spices and fruits. Because I think in a certain way, I just don't really believe that most regular wine buyers, when they read a description like that, I don't think it translates to what the wine tastes like in their mind. It just ends up being, you have the classic thing with like people who are not in the business, they'll say, I don't know, I guess it tastes like plums. Yeah, but sure, absolutely.
Yeah, that was
Right.
kind of going to be my question. Like, what carries the most value? Like, is it the flavor descriptions? Do people even, I hope people care about the stories, but do people even care about the stories? Like, does that have an impact on whether you purchase it or not? I don't,
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I
I
mean,
hope so too.
I spent 700 pages trying to convince people of
Right?
that. If you work in retail, that a lot of people look at a label and buy it because it looks cool.
Right. Yeah. The marketing of the label could not be, yeah,
Yeah. But I
disregarded.
don't, I don't know that people like see that a wine tastes like black cherries and crushed black pepper with a little bit of mint and think, well, I'll
Like,
buy that.
ooh, I want
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
And that's why the score system was created, which
Yeah.
is both good and bad. I mean, I think that it does answer a problem, which is that and I describe this in a book. It's like you walk into a wine store, particularly a big store, like let's say a Total Wine or a Costco or something like that, and you've got 300 Chardonnays. And some of them are $4.99, and some of them are $12.99, and some of them are $79.99, and a few of them are $800 a bottle. And some of them are single vineyard Chardonnays, and some of them are single area Chardonnays, and some of them are made by super famous winemakers. And it's like if you had the same and it was chicken soup, and you had chicken soup that was like $3.99 to $900 a can, and it was all single chicken soup, and chicken soup from Spain, and chicken soup from Italy, and chicken soup from Germany. First, you would think the store owner was completely out of his mind, and second, you'd be out of there within seconds, going like, "I'm never touching chicken soup again." And that's the score system works to help people narrow the choice. The problem is that it's seen as objective, and it's not. It's subjective. I mean, all aesthetic judgment is subjective to some degree. And saying this wine, you see that every time you compare scores between different critics. It's like the wine got 92 from this guy, and it got 96 from this guy, and 89 from that woman. And then you're kind of like, well, okay, so where's reality here? I love debating this kind of stuff. I think it's fascinating, but I'd like to think that the stories do tell people something about the wine and make it, make the experience of drinking it different. I mean, I think it's one reason why we go to wine country and come away and buy wines from those wineries, because we've been there and we have some association with it that means something to us.
And it brings it back to that it's not just what's in the glass.
It's not.
It's that
not,
other part that is fulfilling, that is not just what it tastes like.
Yeah. Though, I mean, there's also, the chef said to me once, sometimes rice is just rice. And it's not like you have to worry about this all the time. Sometimes you just want a glass of wine at a cocktail party.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to know the story behind it. But I do think if you are into wine, you gain a lot from just doing a little bit of, not even investigation, just kind of opening yourself up to learning about a little bit more about the wines.
Right. I'd like to thank you for the the guidance, the stories, and the
This is
fight
fabulous.
of buying better wine in
You're
your
so fun
book.
to talk to.
Thanks. You guys are too.
Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, it's really nice to connect with you. Yeah, I mean, good luck to both of you. I mean, I still maintain it's a great business to be in. That's partly because of the people in the business.
It's fun, but it's getting harder to convince my doctor that I taste thousands of wines a year, and it's good for me. But
Yeah, it's true. But doctors are some of the biggest wine collectors, I will say.
yeah,
At least you're a guy. Your like daily allowance of wine is twice what mine is, so you can get a
Fine
little
point.
bit more away from that.
Uh,
Thank you for listening to us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We have been your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi. You can find our past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes. And as always, we are on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Please leave us your questions and comments. You can always find our articles on our Facebook page. This week's guest has been Ray Isle. You can find him on his website, which is rayisle.com, and his book, The World in a Wine Glass, is what we have been talking about today. So thank you, Ray, for joining us, and we will see you the next time on The Wonderful World of Wine. Cheers.
Cheers.
Wine, wine.